Voyager's rendezvoused with an alien ship, and one whose species we know, albeit indirectly. They're the same as two of our Borgettes, namely Gin and Tonic, so we're handing them over. Janeway says she's glad that they can be with their own people, which feels like a pretty bloody flimsy reason to be handing them over to complete strangers. Even more confusing is that they're also going to be taking Mazzotti. Maybe we had some sort of buy two, get one free offer on. Ramrod's hanging around at least, and I'm sure there are great things in his future when he gets back to Federation space. We bid most of the Borgettes farewell, and on the way back to the cargo bay they called home, Seven suggests to Ramrod that they should disable the recharging stations that aren't being used. He thinks that feels a bit wrong when they've only just left, and he's got a fair point when they spent 2 fucking years being turned on without anybody using them before the Borgettes turned up. She assumes his response is emotional, a comment that might carry more weight if she wasn't crying when she said it. She calls it a malfunction of one of her facial augmentations, and despite that sounding like an excuse, it isn't. The Doc's skeptical too, until he detects a problem with her brainial implant, and a little prompting has Seven admit that she's previously been experiencing headaches. The Doc will investigate with tests, but Seven doesn't want Janeway to be informed about it. Keeping her out of the loop on Seven's medical record isn't something they normally do, which is a little curious, but the Doc agrees to respect her wish for confidentiality. Down in Astrometrics, Seven interrupts Ramrod going over the requirements for entry into Starfleet Academy. Doing map stuff is all well and good, but he wants to become more involved in other things on the ship, and his eye is on the bridge. That might be considered optimistic on any other ship, but they let Neelix up there last week while they were fighting the Borg, so Ramrod should be fine. While they discuss things, Seven has a bit of a problem with one of her Borgmentations not wanting to stay still. She hides it and makes her excuses to leave, but it's not an isolated problem. In the cargo bay, she finds herself unable to recharge. The pod's fine, but her head isn't, that brainial implant preventing her from starting the recharging cycle. Will she have to resort to sleeping in a bed like the rest of the crew? Maybe she'll finally get her own fucking room. She instead spends the night in the mess hall, surprised to learn the time when Neelix arrives in the morning. She's even more surprised when her skin opens up and pokes some metal through, and she has a bit of a lie down while Neelix calls sickbay. The news isn't great. Her brainial implant is all kinds of buggered, and it's making her other Borgmentations start to get rejected by her body. Unfortunately, those Borgmentations are in control of a number of functions that keep her alive, so having them stop working is clearly not ideal. Seven clings to the idea that her brainial implant will correct itself, but that's not likely according to the Doc, and repairing it isn't an option as it's too complicated. If one started going wrong for the average Borg, the collective would just replace it instead of fucking about. We can't replicate them either, which does kind of raise the question of how the Borg make them in such quantities that they're considered disposable, but we might have an alternative. Voyager passed some Borg wreckage a few days back, and they may have either spares or corpses to harvest them from. I guess the Doc got rid of that drone corpse we had on Voyager a couple of years ago. Of course, visiting a Borg graveyard carries some risks. They regularly come back to salvage their wrecks, except for that time in an episode where they ignored a whole ship, or that other time in a different episode where they ignored a different whole ship. Other than those, they definitely do it a lot. That's why Janeway doesn't want to risk Voyager and is instead going to take the flyer, which is impressive given that we watched it get kaboomed in the last story. That was a month ago though, so they've apparently built a new one. Makes you wonder why they don't upgrade all of their shuttles with them if they're so easy to replace, but let's ignore that for now. Paris and Tuvok want to go with her, because it's not a proper away mission unless you're risking at least 3 senior staff, and they're stopped by Ramrod on the way to the shuttle bay. He's distressed to learn about Seven apparently having not been informed, and makes a request to join the away team. She turns him down, perhaps worried that the Delta Flyer Jr. won't be able to take off if it's carrying the weight from 4 suits of plot armor. Instead, he goes to see Seven in sickbay. She's not pleased to see him, and even less chuffed about being asked questions. The Doc intervenes and takes him aside, explaining that the anger isn't about him specifically, but rather the situation. He advises Ramrod to respect her wishes for solitude until she asks for company, and Ramrod leaves. The Delta Flyer Jr., which has had a lick of orange paint inside to indicate that it's definitely not the old set, honest, has arrived at the Borg debris. They find a chunk with some corpses in, or bits of corpses at least, and Janeway and Tuvok teleport over for a gander. Despite the ship having been kaboomed so much that it's in pieces, this section still has oxygen. We find a drone that's seen better days and make things worse by taking a laser to its head. After removing a section of skin that doesn't match the hole and popping it in her toolbox for some fucking reason, Janeway ejects the brainial implant, complete with glowing green bits so that you know it's Borg. Mission complete then, and time to leg it, except we need something to go wrong first for tension. It comes in the form of a warning from Paris about an incoming ship before his call cuts out. Some company teleports over to join Janeway and Tuvok, but it's not the expected Borg. Instead, we're accosted by what I can only describe as emo Klingons, but rather than ask for directions to an MCR concert, they tell us that all of this junk belongs to them. Janeway's not in the mood to barter and instead holds her laser shiv to the neck of the lead emo. He throws her off and pooping happens, Tuvok taking down 2 before being hit by a 3rd. They're teleported back to the Delta Flyer Jr. before things can get worse, and after an exchange of poop with the emo Klingon ship, we leg it with our stolen goods and one more enemy for the list. They arrive back at Voyager just as Neelix and the Doc have conspired to goad Seven into a game of Codiscot, the prospect of invasive surgery likely coming as blessed relief from spending time with Neelix. The procedure involves Seven being covered in only a sheet, presumably just in case the cranial surgery requires emergency access to her tits. We cut open the access port to her head and switch out the old brainial implant for the new one. Alarms do alarm things, the Doc says she's rejecting the new implant, and Seven does a dead on the table. Not really, of course, as it's just a simulation, which, if anything, makes it even more puzzling that she wasn't wearing clothes. It's the 12th simulation, in fact, and has gone down the shitter every single time. The new implant has been dormant for too long, so it just isn't working. Janeway wants to go to a Borg ship and rip one out of a still-functioning drone, apparently having forgotten that the Doc isn't as comfortable with exchanging lives as she has become. He's blunt in his response. He'll carry on working, of course, but there's a chance this problem simply doesn't have a solution. Seven takes the news poorly. Assurances from the Doc that people are trying to find a way to repair her current brainial implant fail to convince her. A request to return to work is denied as she needs to be monitored, but the Doc agrees to ramrod bringing some of her work to sickbay. When he arrives a little later, there's nobody there. That's because Seven disabled the Doc and scarpered, leaving her badge so she can't be tracked. She's hiding in engineering, mixing her desire to flee with an attempt to be productive. B'Elanna's the one who finds her and warns her that the Doc's in a bit of a flap looking for her. A conversation on mortality and a potential afterlife is interrupted by the Doc finding them. His demand for Seven to go back to sickbay is declined, and B'Elanna lends Seven her support, saying she could use the help. The Doc surrenders and lets her stay, as long as she wears a flashy gizmo, and we all get back to work. Even Ramrod's been keeping busy, despite his concern for Seven. She's had a word with Janeway about Ramrod wanting more duties, and he'll be permitted to take the Starfleet Academy entrance exam. Seven's also giving him a list of people who'll help with his studies, the implication being that it'll be useful once she's done a dead. He's not ready to hear it, or to give up like he thinks she has, and he leaves. He's back later, though, and looking through medical gubbins on his own. Maybe another former drone can spot something the Doc hasn't. Ramrod's found something. Seven needs a working brainial implant. Ramrod has a working brainial implant. Problem solved. The Doc dismisses it out of hand, but Ramrod explains that it's not necessarily the death sentence that it sounds like. Ramrod was pulled out of the Borg ovens before he was fully cooked, meaning his body is less reliant on the brainial implant to control things, and that can be fixed by doing a genetics to him. It's harder for the Doc to argue when Ramrod is putting the data right in front of him, and he gives it a look. Whatever it was must have been convincing. As Seven and Janeway are having a heart-to-heart in astrometrics, the Doc calls them both. We're having a chat in the meeting room rather than sickbay, not quite sure why, as they aren't even using the chairs, so there was no real reason to drag everybody up there, but let's ignore that for now. They needn't have bothered with the meeting at all. As soon as Seven learns that the procedure comes with an element of risk for Ramrod, she refuses to participate and leaves. Ramrod gets pissed off and leaves too, after Janeway says she won't order her to go through with it. If there's one thing that being on Voyager teaches anybody, it's that we can bend the rules we don't like until they resemble a fucking pretzel. That's why the Doc and Seven, summoned by Ramrod, find him in the cargo bay, having performed a bit of self-surgery. He's disconnected his own brainial implant himself using the interface of his recharging pod and locked them out of the system so they can't fix it. On the plus side, he's still alive, mostly, so the principle of him being able to survive without his head computer seems sound. That's not to say it'll be easy. We emergency teleport everybody to sickbay where Seven wants to know what the bloody hell's going on. She tells the doc to reconnect Ramrod's brainial implant, but Ramrod's playing Seven's game and refusing treatment. He'll accept the genetic gubbins, but not the brainial implant, meaning it'll get wasted if nobody uses it. The ensuing argument gives Ramrod an opportunity to admonish Seven for never accepting help from those around her, despite her willingness to help others. Janeway and the doc note that he's got a point, and Seven relents. Preparations are made and surgery happens, Ramrod proving that the naked except for a sheet rule applies to all patients. I'm not sure if that's better or worse. Seven's been left recharging for nearly a whole week, so unless someone's been taking care of her biological needs, it's probably just as well that her outfit was already brown. To sickbay, where we learn that Ramrod's been having a rough time, but will maybe, perhaps, probably heal, I guess. We wake him, and Seven tells him that his reward for all of this will be a grueling regime of study with her, and we leave her to have a bit of a cry as we fly away. What the shitting hell kind of send-off was that? OK, gin and tonic had been largely underused, but Mazzotti was fun. She electrocuted Paris. They might have only been in the show for half a season, but they still warrant more of a goodbye than 1 minute and 26 seconds at the start of an unrelated story. Unnamed guy called Durst got a better goodbye than that, and he only got to talk a handful of times over 2 fucking episodes. It's not helped by the whole thing being a little ethically dubious. The people we're handing gin and tonic over to have given no indication of knowing anything about their background. Their only link is of being the same species, and the whole you should be with your own kind argument has never really sat well with me, even before we consider how that turned out for Ramrod. Mazzotti doesn't even have that link. Her only reason for going with them is gin and tonic themselves. On the other hand, her conversation with Ramrod heavily implies that the decision is hers, so we could infer from it that gin and tonic were similarly in charge of their own destiny and chose this. There's certainly an argument to be made that a stable life on a planet would be more conducive to their growth than Voyager's regular kaboom events. From a safety perspective, this may well be in their best interests. All of which is to say that there's enough here to have warranted a whole episode exploring their departure. A minute and a half is, frankly, bullshit. Still, I'm sure every single episode of Season 7 will be absolutely amazing to account for them not devoting 45 minutes to this story instead. Let's take a look at Seven's behaviour during this one, shall we? You've probably heard of the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. You've probably also heard them misquoted as being a clear linear path, despite the psychiatrist herself stating that they're not. That episode of The Simpsons where Homer eats fugu fish has a lot to answer for. In reality, people treat the news of a terminal illness differently, and there's no set path. Seven touches on some but not all of those stages, and I'm glad the writers didn't make her adhere to the incorrect structure that most people know. For all of its faults, Voyager has consistently treated difficult topics with an even-handed tactfulness, and we should give recognition for that. Seven's reaction, as well as being entirely understandable in its own right, is a continuation of something we saw previously. Just after she joined Voyager, she was injured while working with Kim. A minor thing, but an indicator of her relative weakness compared to her existence with the Borg. Having to consider her own mortality is the extreme of that scale. But there's potentially more to it, and one hinted at by the title of the episode. Every medical issue, every perceived weakness or flaw, is one more step away from the perfection that she spent so much of her life indoctrinated into worshipping. She may have had quite some time now to consider the flaws of that pursuit, but logic is so much harder to come by when you're feeling vulnerable, and it will not have escaped her attention that, as a drone, this problem would have been solved with relative ease. Even with all the progress she's made over the last few years in seeing the Borg for what they are, that simple fact must be a cause of conflict within her. Before we go, there's one more point to consider: the ethics around informing Janeway of Seven's medical findings. That made sense originally to an extent. Janeway is her guardian of sorts, and Seven was a potentially hostile entity, so it involves the safety of the ship. It also makes sense from a purely logistical point of view. Seven has resource requirements that other members of the crew don't, even if 3 of them really should have after being assimilated in the last episode, but that's an argument for another time. The question is, how much of it still happening now is because that original choice set a precedent rather than it being Seven's wish? It's good that she's able to articulate a desire for it to stop here, but I wonder if that would have been the case had she not experienced a health problem. There is, if we look at things a little differently, another explanation. I'll admit it's a touch tenuous, but it's not impossible, so let's explore it. Seven speaks in this episode of a misguided desire to measure up to Janeway's expectations. Is Seven's continued willingness to forward medical reports to Janeway a kind of fucked up attempt at seeking praise? Look at me, I'm winning at health. That would fit with her deciding to keep news of her illness from Janeway. Now, I said that was a stretch, and I'm not convinced of it myself, but we spicy brains often set illogical goals or targets for ourselves, so there is a chance. That chance is increased based on the onus she places on Janeway's opinion. Has Janeway's attempt at mentorship caused an unhealthy side effect in her ward? And could that side effect even have been avoided with Seven, someone conditioned to looking for purpose from others? Are the Borg still fucking up Seven's life years after she left? Or am I just pulling ideas out of my arse again? End of episode.
Look, I know we're supposed to do a little scene at the end of these things, but...
Why?
What?
Why are we supposed to do them?
Well, I don't know, really. We just kind of fell into it, didn't we? These bits after the script were only ever supposed to be for begging and a place to put the credits. Now we've got to do 2 of these fucking things every week. Anyway, I know we're supposed to do a little scene, but the boss wanted us to make a public service announcement instead.
Are we getting paid?
Oh, it bollocks. Anyhow, if you're on his Patrimonium and you've not already voted for what he's going to do after Voyager gets flushed, you need to go there now and do it.
Right now?
Well, there's 20 more days, but let's be honest, if you put it off, you're just going to forget to do it, aren't you? Best to get it out the way. Oh, and he said something about the original series also including the animated series, but he forgot to mention that on the poll. Incompetent twat. I don't know why you pay him.
Wait. There was an animated series?
Apparently, yeah. I've heard it was shit.
Perfect. Maybe they'll offer us a job. Woof.